Hello, welcome to the Ocean County Library. Our presentation today is called Wild Nights with Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, Early Days. American poet Emily Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, as Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. Emily had two siblings, an older brother named Austin and a younger sister named Lavinia. Emily's family had wealth and were considered to be prominent figures in the Amherst community. Emily's father, Edward, served as a Massachusetts state senator for one term between 1854 and 1855 and was treasurer of Amherst College, a local university for educating religious men that was founded by Emily's grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson. As Emily grew up in their family home, named the Homestead, she, along with her sister Lavinia, assisted with domestic chores. In Emily's spare time, she would go outside to study plants or read books in her father's library. Emily loved to read poetry books and would frequently copy the poems she found in her father's library so that she may try to improve upon it. Additionally, Emily also loved reading books written by women authors, such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Charlotte Bronte. In 1841, Emily enrolled at Amherst Academy, where she studied foreign languages, history, philosophy, and botany. She graduated from the school in 1847. Shortly after graduation, Emily attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary School in South Hadley, Massachusetts. She attended the school for only 1 year before returning home to Amherst to be with her family. Home for Emily would prove to be her favorite place. Emily Dickinson, Journey to Poetry. Beginning in the 1850s, Emily started to really focus on writing her poetry. During this time, she developed a close friendship with law student Benjamin Franklin Newton, who worked at her father's law office. Benjamin encouraged Emily to pursue her poetry and even introduced her to the poetry of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which influenced her style of writing. In 1852, Benjamin submitted a mock Valentine poem Emily had written for him titled Sic Transit to a publication called Springfield Republican. It was the first time a poem by Emily had appeared in a paper. In 1853, Benjamin died, affecting Emily greatly. The theme of death would appear in Emily's poetry from this point on until the end of her life. Emily's most famous poem on this subject matter was poem number 479, otherwise known as Because I Could Not Stop for Death. The first stanza notes the somber tone. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. In 1855, Emily and her sister visited their father in Washington, D.C. as he served Congress. During this trip, Emily met Reverend Charles Wadsworth, whom she would begin a lifelong correspondence with until his death in 1882. Her letters to Wadsworth were in a mentor nature as Emily sought advice on her poetry. This would not be the last time Emily would seek an opinion about her poetry. Emily Dickinson, Finding Her Poetry Style. Emily would often send poems in her letters to family and friends as gifts. She would be inspired to write a poem after watching birds, studying flowers, or other activities she did at or near her home. Most of these poems were short and untitled. Emily hardly ever gave her poem titles. The style of Emily's poetry was innovative and ahead of its time. She would use dashes to symbolize pauses, place capital letters on words she wanted emphasized, and created slant stanzas in her poetry. Emily's unique poetry style can be seen in poem 219, otherwise known as My River Runs to Thee. My river runs to thee, blue sea, wilt welcome me? My river waits reply, O sea, look graciously. I'll fetch thee brooks from spotted nooks. Say sea, take me. By 1858, Emily had written over 50 poems, and in 1859 it would increase to 100. Emily again sought advice on her poetry. This time she started a correspondence with Samuel Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican, the paper that had published her first poem. Over the course of several years, Samuel received from Emily 51 poems that she hoped he would publish in his paper. Samuel never did, and in 1860 wrote an article in his newspaper criticizing the poetry of this form as the product of lonely women. Although his article didn't list any names, Emily took it as being directed at her. Shortly after this moment, Emily began to slowly withdraw from the world. Emily Dickinson, Hiding Away and Loss. In 1862, Emily wrote to literary critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who contributed articles to the Atlantic Monthly. Higginson received from Emily 4 poems that she hoped could be published in the paper. Once again, Emily's poems were not published, and Higginson suggested her poetry was not good enough to be accepted by the public. After this latest rejection, Emily never tried to have her poems published again. Instead, Emily focused on staying home, taking care of her parents, and writing her poetry for her own private enjoyment. In 1874, Emily's father, Edward, passed away. The next year, her mother had a stroke, and Emily would spend her days taking care of her. With the passing of her father and her mother's ongoing illness, Emily became more reclusive to her family and her friends. She rarely ever left her family home and stayed inside her room when guests would come by to visit. Despite her growing isolation from the world, Emily began a friendship with Judge Otis Lord, a widowed man who was 18 years her senior and close friend of her deceased father's. The friendship became romantic, and in 1882, Judge Otis asked Emily to marry him. Emily declined due to her wish to remain free and independent. Also in 1882, Emily's mother passed away after her long illness. In the next few years, Emily experienced more death, with the passing of her nephew in 1883 and Judge Otis in 1884. All of these events would lead to Emily's mental and physical health to suffer. Emily Dickinson, Death and Fame. In 1886, Emily's mental and physical health was declining. For several months, she was confined to her bed due to an infection of her kidneys. Doctors eventually diagnosed the kidney infection as Bright's disease. On May 15, 1886, Emily died at her home from her illness. After Emily's funeral, her sister Lavinia was clearing out Emily's room. As Lavinia was clearing out her sister's things, she discovered a dresser that contained inside its drawers 1,775 poems. The poems Lavinia discovered had been organized and bound into small booklets. Upon finding this, Lavinia was determined to get Emily's poems published. To accomplish this task, Lavinia asked the help of Mabel Loomis Todd, who was her brother Austin's mistress, and literary critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who previously corresponded with Emily during her life. Higginson was able to secure a publisher to print Emily's poems, although Higginson and Todd took liberty to edit drastically Emily's poems in order to make them, in their view, sellable to the public. In 1890, the poems were published as a first volume called Poems by Emily Dickinson. The book was a huge success and was reprinted 11 times within 2 years of release. Emily had become in death a world-famous poet. Future book volumes featuring other poems in the collection by Emily were successful, but again, her poetry was vastly edited to make the book sellable. It wasn't until 1955 that scholar Thomas H. Johnson undertook the task of collecting all of Emily's poems and reconstructed them in Emily's original poetic style. Johnson removed the created titles and replaced it with numbers as Emily had them in her original booklets. He also removed all the edits Todd and Higginson had made and restored the poems to their original text as Emily had intended them to be. Johnson's efforts helped to create a 3-volume book series that restored Emily's poems to their original state. This edition would become a bestseller with the public and solidified Emily's legacy as an innovative poet in the literary world. Emily Dickinson, Poetry Legacy. Since the publication of Emily's poems in 1890, her popularity in the literary world and the public continues to grow. Emily's poetry continues to inspire and be consumed in other entertainment formats. In 1977, a play written by William Luce called The Belle of Amherst, based on Emily Dickinson's life, was brought to Broadway in New York City. The play was a success and won a Tony Award for actress Julie Harris, who portrayed Emily in the show. In October 2014, a revival of the play was brought back to Off-Broadway in New York City, starring actress Jolie Richardson. Again, the play received a critical praise and was a success. Emily Dickinson's life and poems have also been made into movies. First in 2017 with the film A Quiet Passion, starring former Sex and the City actress Cynthia Nixon as Emily. Then again in 2019 with the film Wild Nights with Emily, starring former Saturday Night Live comedian and actress Molly Shannon playing Emily. In October 2019, online streaming service Apple TV created a show called Dickinson that starred actress Haley Steinfeld in the lead as Emily. The show became popular on Apple TV and was renewed for a second season. As we have seen today, the life and poetry of Emily Dickinson continues to grow in popularity. New generations of the public continue to discover Emily and fall in love with her poetry, a lasting testament to the talent and genius of one of America's greatest poets. Emily Dickinson Sources. All the information presented today was found using the Ocean County Library's databases. These databases are free to use at home or in the library at any of our 21 branches with your Ocean County Library card. Emily Dickinson, Image Sources. All of the images shown in this presentation can be found at the following sources. Emily Dickinson, materials at the Ocean County Library. Check out the Ocean County Library's website to search our database or catalog to find books, articles, or movies about Emily Dickinson. To search our catalog or access our databases, please visit the Ocean County Library's website at www.theoceancountylibrary.org. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed this presentation at the Ocean County Library.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.